Okay, so this is my talk, and really it's about British social policy. I teach social policy and spend most of my time looking at developments in parenting culture through considering policy. So that's why I'm talking about that. And I mean, one of the reasons why we became so certain that what we wanted to do with this event was to talk about the brain and brain science was because of this picture. I don't know how many people are familiar. Does this look familiar to you? Yes, maybe people from, I'm not allowed to, other Europeans. I got told off earlier on saying people from Europe and not including England as part of Europe. Anyway, people from other parts of the world may not be especially familiar with this picture. Those of us studying social policy in England are, because it's adorned the front of two major policy statements that have been put out over the last year, authored by a Labour Member of Parliament called Graham Allen. You know, I mean, I saw these documents, and however much you study things and however much you realise how scientised things are becoming and however much you discuss parenting culture, I've got to say I was really shocked to see such a strange picture on the front of a policy document, and the idea that this was supposed to tell us something meaningful about the nature of our culture and society and what policymakers should be doing. I was just really surprised, and what on earth are we supposed to make of all of this? I mean, I don't know. I mean, clearly the message that it's putting forward is that this is a picture of British society in some way, and there are vast swathes of children who we should really be worried about, who are like this, whose brains have been shrunken. Seriously, I mean, why else would you have it on the front of a policy document? I mean, that's what's being said. So this is what kind of got me all stirred up about the thing. I mean, it seemed to me to be an apparently implausible claim. I think Stuart might talk a little bit more tomorrow about these types of images and where on earth they come from. But one thing is, it's almost impossible to find where they come from. So even though they're on the front of these documents, you can't actually find out where they came from and what their derivation is. The authors of the document don't consider it their responsibility to tell us very much about them at all, which in itself I find quite striking. The only thing that I can find about this particular image in the documents is this. So that's the only reference to it, which doesn't even relate directly to the picture. And as I say, tells us almost nothing at all about anything, and certainly doesn't seem to me to tell us very much about how we might understand the problem of British society or things that we might want to do. The fact that neuroradiologists interpreted 11 of 17 scans in some study as abnormal. I mean, what's that got to do with anything, really? Anyhow, so that's where it's at. So I thought it would just be good to try and look at this a bit more and to try and understand what on earth's going on. So that's really where we started. It has become very apparent, though, the more I've gone on discussing this and getting into debates about it, that it is a claim, regardless of its apparent implausibility, it's a claim with a great deal of traction. So there is a really significant absorption of the idea that that picture is meaningful. It does actually mean something, and it's telling us something very true and very troubling and worrying about children in British society. But that idea has a great deal of traction. It's very much absorbed amongst policymakers, policy circles, and there's plenty of us in this room who've been along to a whole bunch of discussions with people involved in you know, various think tanks and campaign groups and what have you. And they all talk about, you know, neuroscience and what we all now know about brains. It just trips off their tongues as if it's just completely obvious. And there are no questions to be asked. And very absorbed into culture, which I think really is what Glenda's going to talk about when she tells us about her research. I thought I'd give you one little example of this from my own recent experience. In July, when Graham Allen put out his second report with that picture on the front cover, I decided to put out a little press release, just a really short thing, where basically I just had a fairly blunt go at it and described it as the new phrenology, and said it isn't really anything else and it's just as silly as the old phrenology. And they published an article about this in a magazine called Nursery World, and the things I'd had to say about it, and this was the response to it. And basically what this guy's saying is you can't, you know, this really does mean something. And what it does is that it tells us even more about the importance of attachment and attachment theory. So this is one point that I wanted to make that we might discuss, and it's a point that John raises in his document, is that there is a definitive and very clear absorption and incorporation of this idea about neuroscience and brains into proponents of attachment theory. They're really, really keen on it. They think it's a really great idea, and they think it's reinforced everything they've ever thought about the importance of attachment. So this letter goes on to say this is why what Graham Allen's doing is really fantastic and so on. So that's certainly a very important part of the parenting industry and a field which involves a lot of different people, a lot of different professionals and so on and so forth, who are certainly big advocates of this particular idea about brains. So we can talk about that. Okay. All I'm going to do now is just go through, mainly just to give a bit of background about recent developments in family policy and the types of stuff that I've been looking at, and say a few things about how these claims about brains work in the current policy framework. So just so that people know, over the last year, there's been this whole slew of documents and statements published about policy and things that should happen, and some of them have been discussed a bit already. And it was certainly the case that as soon as the coalition government came into power in May last year in this country, things really started moving very rapidly in terms of the development of a very clear agenda around early intervention, predicated on a lot of these claims about what we know and what the evidence tells us about the early years. So these are the policy documents if people want to go and track them down and have a look at them. Frank Field and Graham Allen are both Labour MPs, but have both published very high-profile, influential documents which have then been welcomed by policymakers and are very much part of what the government says it's going to do. One thing I wanted to note also is that these types of claims also appear in documents which talk about social mobility. So it's a slightly different language, but claims about the early years in the brain are very key to the types of arguments that policymakers are making about how we address social mobility and essential to all of that. So you've got this very kind of cross-party thing going on. The Conservatives are into it, Labour's into it, and the Liberal Democrats are into it. This document here, just so that you know, is the one that people might have seen that argued for the 5-a-day parenting campaign. So that parenting campaign is seen as being a way of increasing social mobility. So if you get parents to do the 5-a-day, follow the rules, they will build their children's brains, and then the children will become more socially mobile. So that's the logic of the argument. So it's called Early Years and Social Mobility, as you can see. What I wanted to do now is just go back to the first of these documents, which was published in 2008 by Ian Duncan Smith, who's now the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions in this country, and Graham Allen, the guy who's gone on to publish the documents with the brain scans on the front. They published this report. It was published by something called this Centre for Social Justice, which was a think tank set up by Duncan Smith. And they really are interested in very much arguing for and pursuing this type of approach. And there's a certain language used in that document, but the ideas that are set out in it are in all of them. But I just think it's a good example of the type of approach. So I just wanted to sketch out the logic of the argument and how it works. The first point to make about it is they are absolutely fixated with the bottom, the people at the bottom. And they have, I don't know what's going on in their minds, but they have got a very particular view of the people at the bottom and what they're like and what their lives are like. The more polite people call them the problem, you know, the people whose problem of social mobility we need to address. So that's the kind of nice way of putting it. Other language is used in other documents. But just so that you know, for those of you who don't live in this country, the type of thing that's being said about what British society is apparently like and what it's like at the bottom. This always strikes me as a particularly interesting comment. Apologies to those who've seen these slides before. A few people here have. The stock and the flow. Second point is that in terms of understanding the bottom and why they're at the bottom, early experience is determinant. So early conditions are the thing that explains why they're there. And this links into Stefan's point. I think this is quite a good example of some of the things that you were saying about citizenship and the types of claims that are made about that. This is one of the main points I wanted to make about the logic of the argument, and one of the things that's interesting about it and the way the brain's discussed is that while the brain is discussed as an organic entity, what these documents are really interested in is what they call nurture. So they don't think the problem is nature. They don't think it is inherently what these children's brains are. They think it's what nurture turns the brains into. And so what they want to attack and address and change and modify is nurture. And they want to make nurture happen in a different way, so it has a different effect on nature. And I think that relationship between nature and nurture is an interesting one, and has particular aspects to it now which make it a bit different to the past. I'll say a bit more about that later. So here, scientific discovery suggests it is nurture rather than nature that plays the lead role in creating the human personality. So this isn't just old-fashioned genetic determinism. It's a different type of claim that's being made here. I also wanted to say, though, and this is with reference to a couple of points that Frank made earlier on, that this by no means that everybody else is only about the bottom. So in this way of thinking, the reason why people aren't at the bottom is because they have done the nurture. So they've read the books, they've done the classes, the middle class read the guidebooks. So that explains in this way of thinking why the middle class are in the position that they're in. Okay, so that's the basic logic of the arguments. The other main point that I wanted to make about it, which we've discussed at previous CPCS events, is extending parenting backwards. So while parents of born children are instructed to nurture nature, and this goes back to some of the discussion in the panel I was in before, actually, about drinking and pregnancy, so are pregnant women and even pre-pregnant women and fathers-to-be. So this kind of idea and this kind of thinking you'll also find in public health policy. And one of the things that's interesting is that public health policy and wider social policy have very similar themes. So the logic of public health policy is to say that if we look at most public health problems that we've got, the big ones they're worried about, people drinking too much, smoking too much, people's mental health and so on and so forth, actually all of those things ultimately rest on people not having enough confidence and self-esteem. So essentially they're psychological problems, and their origin is in what went on in the early years. So if we want to address these public health problems, then what we need to do is to change what happens in the early years. So to address these public health problems, we need to think about what happens before conception, through pregnancy, and early parenting is key because of what goes on with neurons. I'll skip through these next few slides. They're basically an advert for Karen Clark, wherever she is. Oh, there. I just wanted to say here that as Karen has demonstrated through all of her work, and if people want to know more about it, they can go and listen to her paper tomorrow. It's certainly not the coalition government that made all of this up. Its history really begins in contemporary British politics with New Labour. So it was New Labour that generated a very distinct approach to parenting and politicised parenting in quite a new way. And you'll also find, if you look back at previous policy documents to the ones now, this stuff about the brain is in there. So a lot of these things about the early brain have been in Department of Health advice in its the first 5 years, which is an advice book for new parents. It's all been in there for quite some time. Okay, so just in terms of where we're at now, what's coming out of this in terms of policy proposals, these are the main ones which have come out of the kind of Frank Field, Graham Allen type approach. So basically what they're saying is that education begins at 0 or in the form of the nurse-family partnership before 0. And obviously you're sort of educating the child, but really what you're doing is training the parent. That's what these things are about, and some of it quite overtly. For example, the National Parenting Programme. I mean, exactly how all of this is going to work out, we still don't know, but it's what's in the offing. And I also think, in relation to the public health stuff, if you look at the types of things that are coming out of public health proposals at the moment, the focus on the preconception period and the period of pregnancy is very, very marked, as is the focus on, for example, things like breastfeeding and encouraging breastfeeding. And that whole argument has got very hooked up with this discussion around brains. So, for example, one of the things that's notable about some of the claims that are now being made about breastfeeding is not only that breastfeeding makes kids more intelligent, so it increases their IQ, it's also claimed it increases their emotional intelligence. So it makes children less stressed because their brains become wired in a different way, and that makes them more socially mobile. So this is all being included as part of breastfeeding promotions, and Dimitri's laughing there. You will not be surprised to know that the evidence base for this comes from the Millennium Cohort Study and the Avon Longitudinal Study. That's the studies which have apparently provided the basis for saying that breastfeeding will create less stressed children who turn out to be less stressed adults. Okay, so this is my final slide. Frank will be pleased. I think I'm on time. What's new? I've had lots and lots of discussions with my social policy colleagues where they just say, well, this is just old wine in new bottles. So you're really going on about this all. Stop talking to me about all of this, Ellie. Just go away. We know all about it. You know, poor people have always been blamed for their own poverty. There's always been this intervention into the family life of poor people. It's always what happens when you've got a recession. It's just a repeat of the past. And of course, a lot of that, you know, in some ways is true. I'm not saying that that isn't the case. I'm also not saying, obviously, there was phrenology and there's eugenic thinking, and there are a lot of the kind of themes and ideas are reflected, and, you know, you do see them in this way of thinking now. However, I do think there are a number of things which I perceive to be a little bit different and quite interesting. The first is this emphasis on nurture, so the nurturing nature idea, which I think is different from the kind of very kind of biologised account of social difference from the past. So, you know, the old phrenology, well, they're them because, you know, you look at their brains, you look at their head size, well, that explains why they're at the bottom and we're somewhere else. So that racialised account of social difference based on a biological view of why some are at the top and some are at the bottom. I don't think that's what's being said now, actually. I think nurturing nature is a bit of a different claim, precisely because of its emphasis on nurture. So the idea is that you can make their brains like the brains of the better off. So that's different. The other thing I think is different, which I do think is very striking, is that the sense I get from these kind of policy discussions is that there is a much more generalised perception that the family is just this really fragile entity. And in fact, they don't even really talk about the family anymore. They talk about relationships between individuals. So that's one of the things about parenting, isn't it? It's the parent and the child. It's not the family unit. And one of the things that's interesting, for example, about the Centre for Social Justice, they're not only really into giving everybody parenting classes and all of this kind of stuff, they really want everybody also to have relationship counselling. To even go into a step back before children and even a step back before pregnancy. They think that people need to have professional support and intervention to work through issues in their relationships to generate any kind of stability. So there seems to be this very strong sense that in general, it's just impossible for us to have relationships with each other anymore in any meaningful sense and work out for ourselves what we want those to be like. And I think that's a bit different, and I think that does underpin a much more generalised idea that, well, all parents need educating and everybody needs training. So it is about the bottom, but it's also about everybody. And I think that's one of the things that underlies that is a real sense of the unreliability of the family. My third point is that I do think, you know, there's always, medicalisation is a very long-standing trend, so is scientisation, there's nothing new. But one of the things I do think is quite distinct is the way emotions are discussed in this approach. Love in particular I find very striking, which is now pretty overtly described as a form of early intervention. You know, it's not an emotion anymore, that's something that is personal and to do with you and somebody else. It's kind of calibrated, measured. It's very clear in the breastfeeding discussions. It's not about showing love for a child, it's about Why Love Matters, Sue Gerhardt's book, which people might have known. Well, the reason why love matters is because it changes the cortisol level in a child's brain, relaxes the mother, and so the children don't become antisocial and the woman doesn't get depressed. I mean, that's how love is discussed as a kind of medicine. And I think that's interesting, and I think it's a bit different to the way these types of feelings, really, something very private and intimate, have been discussed previously, which brings me to my final point, which is I do think what this is leading to, which ultimately is my big worry about the whole thing and why I'm so wound up about it, is a really proactive assault on the idea of privacy, which I think is unprecedented. I just wanted to say something about privacy, referring back to your talk earlier on and so on and so forth. I mean, the reason why I'm bothered about privacy isn't because I want there to be isolated families, which are, you know, it's not the kind of isolated model of the nuclear family where people are just set apart from anything else. What I mean more by privacy is the capacity for all of us, in our own way, and in a way we see fit, to be given the space and the time to reflect on experience, to think about what goes on in our relationships with other people, to consider those in all of their dimensions. And I think that the minute you get this constant attempt to oversee and to intervene in relationships, which I agree with Frank are pre-political ones, then you destroy privacy, you destroy that capacity for private reflection and for consideration of moral questions and how we want to live our life. And that's what I think is really going on at the moment. So I certainly agree that there should be public policy about the family, and its focus should be providing childcare. That's what it should be. So I'm not saying the state shouldn't do anything in relation to the family, or policymakers shouldn't do anything. What they should do is provide good childcare for people. And everything else they should just stay out of, because we need that ability to reflect, and our emotions should be our own. They shouldn't be colonised by this type of approach. That's it.